We're now going to talk about Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who was born in 1841 and died in 1919. He lived at a time before we understood rheumatoid arthritis, any parts of it. What allowed Renoir to paint? He was born in February of 1841. His family moved from Limoges to Paris to seek a better life because there was an industrial revolution at that time. At age 15, because he liked to copy, draw and doodle, they placed him as an apprentice where he copied French scenes onto teacups and vases. If you find a teacup and a vase of the Eiffel Tower or some French scene with the letter R on it, call me collect. But then he realized he needed a little bit more formal education, so he enrolled in the École des Beaux-Arts, and here he was to learn the academic realism that was necessary for the acceptance of the paintings by the salons. And the salons were the government-sponsored art exhibitions at that time. When you had your painting accepted there, it was like getting an NIH grant. You were in. So one of the paintings that was turned down by the salons was this nude torso in the sunlight. It's a little bit irregular. It's off-center. This nude figure is coming out of the forest, and it has this impressionist light-capturing kind of mode rather than the dramatic realism that was necessary for the acceptance of his works by the salons, so this was turned down. And if you look at it, you can see both warm and cool modulations. Notice the blue on the chest that sort of reflect the sky, and then the red that circles the breast and even obliterates the nipples so as not to distract from the overall effect. And notice that she's wearing jewelry, even though she's a nymph coming out of the forest. Do you like that painting? Here's what the critics said about that painting. Tried to explain to Renoir that a woman's torso is not a mass of flesh decomposing with purple-green splotches that look like the final stages of putrefaction in a corpse. That reads like the pink sheet of my last NIH grant application. And everybody that's been to Chicago knows On the Terrace, which is in the Art Institute of Chicago. I love this painting because it's the scientists, it's the conservators there, Mary Jean Butler and Inga Fiedler, that study all their paintings to try and conserve them. They want to know how they're made and how they're put together. And they were able to determine that in this painting, Renoir only used 7 paints. How was he able to get all those different kinds of variations of colors? He painted wet into wet. That meant he took the paintbrush and he dipped it into one color, put it on the canvas, took a different paintbrush, put it into a different color, and then mixed it while it was still wet. Now you know where I'm going with that. Did his technique change after he developed rheumatoid arthritis? Wet into wet, beautiful painting, varied colors, only 7. So here is Madame Clopizon that Inga sent me, and if you look in the upper right-hand corner where he signed his name, you can see that the individual colors are mixed, and some you can see as individualistic, and some you can see as blended together. And Renoir could paint in the Impressionist style of his good friend Monet. So here is, how many of you have been to St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice? Gorgeous scenery, right? And you can see this gold cathedral with its orange gilded work shining in this Venetian sky, stabilized by the campanile, that bell tower on the right-hand side. He could paint in that style, but he liked to paint figures. And he liked to paint his friends. So this is Moulin de la Galette, an interesting mix of rich and poor, an aristocrat and bohemian, and here they're having a good time at the nightlife in Paris. And this is probably his best painting, which is Luncheon of a Boating Party, in the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. So I'm going through these rather quickly, but I want to point out on this one, which is regarded as his best painting, how he organized it. So if you draw lines from the upper right to the lower left, and then from the upper left to the lower right, so that they cross, you can see that every action is opposed by a counteraction. Furthermore, the x-rays of that, which show the lead-based paints, show that he put in this 2 things he changed from the original painting of his friends here. One is this lady, Aileen Cherigot, that's holding the dog, who's 21 years of age at this time and possessed of that Renoir look, simple and unpretentious and destined to become Madame Renoir, by the way, that she was looking out at you. And he realized that if he did that, your eye would stay on her face. So he turned her to look in so that your eye would stay in the center. Furthermore, if your eye stayed in the center, it would go around and then go out into the water here. So at the last minute, he put in this awning so that your eye would stay there. So it's that well organized so he can fit 14 people in such a restricted space without it making look confused. Isn't that a gorgeous painting? So since it takes several years before even a layperson can see the typical deformities of rheumatoid arthritis, maybe 1888 was the right time. Let's remember that date as the start of his rheumatoid arthritis. And so let's look at every painting after 1888. Two girls reading, young girls at the piano. That's Edouard Manet's daughter and his goddaughter in the dark hair. And so what did he do? He took responsibility for his disease. He designed his own exercise equipments. He juggled leather balls. He played with his ball and peg game in which you throw the ball up and it's got a little hole in it and you catch it in the peg. I took that in the backyard of Jean Renoir's home in Beverly Hills. He went to the spa therapies in the south of France, and he took the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug antipyrine, which is a congener of butazolidine, no longer used because butazolidine is off the market, as is antipyrine, since it will give you some aplastic anemia in your bone marrow. He may have also taken arsenic and aspirin. We just don't know. I couldn't find any documentation in reading his letters. And look, he can paint his family, 1896. 1896, that's 14 years later. And now there's Aileen in her wonderful costume with a beautiful hat and a fur coat on her left arm. And then their son is wearing the Ralph Lauren costume of the day, right? Also named Pierre. And then the little child down below is Jean Renoir in a beautiful outfit. And that's Gabrielle, Aileen's first cousin, who has been hired to help take care of Renoir. And here's a painting that was done in that year of his son Jean, where the light can be captured on the red hair, the Naples yellow ribbon, the crimson smock. And he can paint himself with his head turned away from the light in restricted dark colors. Is he depressed? Is it due to Stéphane Mallarmé, his friend's death? Is it due to his rheumatoid arthritis? But then in 1901, he gets a remission. And here he's painted again, but notice the swelling of his metacarpal phalangeal joint in that index finger. And look at the deformity in his hands as he's still sitting in that chair. And then in 1903, he moves to the south of France to seek the better weather. He rents behind the post office, you can see in the photograph. He's wearing a pretty heavy coat. He writes a letter at that time. He says, I weigh 49 kilos, and that's not fat. That's barely 100 plus pounds. He said, the bones go through my body, and after a while, I can't bear to sit. And the reason he couldn't sit is because he had a rheumatoid nodule on the back that had to be resected because it got infected. And there's the scene. And so that you saw in the photograph, and you begin to say, uh-oh, I can see he's changed his style. And the people at the Art Institute tell us, right, he's not painting wet into wet anymore. He's painting dry into dry. So is that the way he wants to paint that, or is that due to his arthritis? So here he is now in 1904. He's class 3. He cannot get about without assistance. He needs help. He needs a cane. He needs a crutch. There's Gabrielle in the back just watching. He couldn't get his feet into shoes, so he cut out the toe box. And then he developed the need for cane and crutch. He had a sedan chair made so that they could transport him to his outdoor studio. And then when he became class 4B, he had a transfer strap made. He had a leather strap made so that Gabrielle on one side and Aileen on the other side could pick him up and transport him from the bed to the wheelchair, and then again from the wheelchair to the toilet. And yet now he can still paint women the way French people look at women of his era. Something on the right, this is Gabrielle to be glorified and beautified and adorned. But then on the left, as the woman who wakes him up in the morning, washes him, feeds him his breakfast, puts the paintbrush into his hands, mixes, calls in the models, arranges everything, because the only thing he wants to do in life is to paint. So he can paint Gabrielle as a friend and a colleague rather than as something to be adorned. So I want to show you this movie of him actually painting now. Look at the ulnar deviation. Look at the paintbrush coming out in between his fingers. There is, for the people who can't see the movie that only saw a still of it, the lay literature says that he painted with the paintbrush in his hand, and he said no. He just held the paintbrush there, and you'll see that in the movie. He painted with his hands always, Jean told me. And he didn't paint with the paintbrushes strapped to his hands, as some of the modern calendars will tell you. And here he is in 1914, painting from the wheelchair, because every painting after 1912, he's class 4B. And the close-up shows that the paintbrush is coming out in between his fingers, and there's the painting. Is that not incredible? Now, if you go to the south of France, you can go to his home in Consumer. And if you go up there, you can see his wheelchair, and you can see his where he placed his paintings. And there's a little turning knob there that pushes the painting up and down. All painters have that, because wherever they are, whether they're standing up or sitting down, they want to see the painting at eye level. He may have needed that more. I assumed that he was having trouble with his shoulder going to the top of the painting, so he had to move the painting down a little bit more, and he probably even moved it down more than his eye level, because when you look at the paintings now, they're a little bit more distorted. Look at the head, and the arms and the legs don't seem to fit on that body. And then he gets a new model in 1915 and paints her 100 times in the last several years of his life. Look at the linen strips. They're on both of his hands, so they're not to strap the paintbrushes there, because he only paints with his right hand. And they're always, every picture I have of him, he's always in a wheelchair when he has the linen strips on. So now his friends come to visit because they realize the end is near. And Monet says he's astonishing. He's said to be very sick. All he wants to do is paint. And Matisse comes and says his works allows us to see an artist who has been given the gifts and talents, and he has been grateful enough to respect them and use them. And again, look at the ulnar deviation of those fingers that have twisted back on themselves. And there's the painting that is 1918, 1919. One of the last, that was at the end of the war, and he wanted to paint a painting of joy for the end of the war. And the last photograph I have of him is 1919, the year that he dies. Look at, again, the ulnar deviation, and if you look at his little pinky, the fifth finger, it looks like it's necrotic. And maybe he's developing what we call a systemic vasculitis. And there's his last painting. Is that not incredible? So I teased you a little bit and said maybe you can tell that he had to change his technique due to his rheumatoid arthritis. I'm not so sure about that, because these are self-portraits done before and after. If he wants to paint in the same genre, there it is. It's hard to tell a difference.